Hi, I'm Laura.
Hi, I'm Deanne.
And I'm Philippe. Hello.
And welcome to our Lymond Book Club. We are reading Checkmate by Dorothy Dunnett. And today we're going to talk about part 2, chapters 1 through 4. Philippe will lead our discussion. But before we dive in, any initial thoughts that you two want to share?
They're nice. I don't think much really happens in these chapters. Again, I think it's a lot of setup, almost filler chapters. There is some interesting stuff. But after coming off of the last 2 chapters we read, which were really awesome and had a lot of interesting stuff, this was a little bit of a slowing down, I think.
That is so funny because I was thinking as I was reading, I was like, wow, so much is happening. Oh. But I guess it's because it wasn't action stuff happening, but there was a lot of plot that happened. Like I thought they went a lot of places and talked to a lot of people and like a lot of stuff. Like clearly the story's moving forward in interesting ways, particularly in the about Lymond's past. And I love that we get like Lymond's thoughts about what he thinks happened, which are obviously not what happened. So it's like whatever he says in this theory that he has, we can obviously check that off as not what's actually happened. So yeah, I thought it was good. I liked it.
I tend to agree more on the Philippe side. I think mainly because it's setting up a lot of the Catherine d'Albon and her mother and like their relationship with Lymond, which at this point, because these are basically new characters for this book, we aren't invested in. So it's having to like learn these new characters and invest in them. Whereas the previous chapters were like Jared and Martin, Philippa, and like people we already cared about. So it was much easier to just like dive in and be super into it.
Yeah.
And that's mostly what I meant. I mean, the whole subplot in the church with the Calvinists, I was like, this is interesting. And I think I know why it's included. But I also feel like it's a subplot. So
why is it included?
Why do you think it's...
I think that Dunnett is setting up Catherine d'Albon to be another obstacle to get in the way of of Lymond and Philippa getting together.
So, sure. I agree with that.
So we develop her character a little bit more, but
yeah, I'm not sure how the Calvinist aspect of it fits in. Like, why did they have to be Calvinist versus just a French lady who gets in trouble with the army? Like, they could have had like the army attack and have Lymond rescue her and her mother from something like it didn't have to be Calvinist. So, I'm intrigued about why. I mean, it could be just like we saw in Pawn and Frankincense, where there was kind of an equitable nature sort of between the atrocities of the Christian world and the atrocities of the Muslim world. And it was kind of this like religion. Dunnett did a really good job of just showing that religion is socially driven and power driven and how there's a lot of bad stuff on all sides kind of thing. And so I wonder if she's kind of doing something similar here with Protestants and Catholics and like, it doesn't really kind of like this doesn't really matter which one you are. There's bad stuff on both sides and all of that. So I don't know.
I think it's also in the historical context of where the politics of Europe are going and where in particular France is going. Being somewhat ignorant of history, but knowing broad strokes, I know that these Catholic Protestant religious wars are coming. And so I think she's also just setting up that thread of history in a very tangible way rather than hearing about it as a general thing happening off screen. It's something we see firsthand as something like that's going to, if we know our history, like grow and become more and more of a conflict.
Yeah, it's kind of super funny too, just from the perspective of someone who is Protestant and grew up Protestant. To see like the Calvinists portrayed as like super rebels and like doing all this like really rebellious, exciting, flouting of convention and all of that, because like today, at least in the United States, like if you're a Calvinist, that's like super conservative. Like there's almost like no kind of Protestant that's more conservative than the Calvinists. So it's just kind of funny. Yeah, anyway. I actually liked getting to know, I think when Catherine d'Albon and her mother sort of showed back up in this chapter, I was kind of like, oh, I thought we were done. Like, I thought we were done with them. I thought they were just like this minor character who showed up earlier. And so when they showed up again, I'm like, oh, here they are again. I'm intrigued with Catherine d'Albon. Like I agree with you, Philippe, that she's being set up as an obstacle, but she kind of feels like an interesting obstacle. Like she doesn't seem like a character that I'm going to automatically hate. You know, I think she seems like she's interesting. She seems slightly adventurous. She cares about her mother, you know, so I'm kind of intrigued where this is going. And she's clearly intrigued with Lymond, which why not? Like we're all intrigued with Lymond. So
she sort of despises him at first in the situation, but then they have one adventure together, and just like almost everybody else in these books, she's smitten immediately with him. So
I mean, so are we, the reader. Like, I feel like she had a very reader-esque response to him, which is as soon as she met him and spent time with him, she's like, oh, who is this guy?
Yeah. I feel like she's almost set up as a foil for Philippa. So
yeah.
Yeah, I think this whole thing is kind of a Philippa light experience because she dislikes him at first. He's got a relationship with her mother, ?
Oh, yeah.
And then, you know, they go through an adventure together. She steps up and comes out of her shell, right? She goes out in drag. She does all this stuff as part of this adventure. And then at the end of it, she's fallen for him and changed her point of view. So the whole thing is a mirror of what happens with Lymond and Philippa, and definitely parallels what just happened in the previous chapter where they had that adventure and then she fell for him.
Yeah. But we are still on Philippa's side. So I don't care how interesting this Catherine person is. Doesn't matter. We like Philippa.
She's not quite Philippa. All right. Should we dive into chapter 1?
Sure. So chapter 1 begins in Paris, and we are in the point of view of Mary Queen of Scots, who we really haven't spent a lot of time with at all since book 2. She is in Paris with Catherine d'Albon. We find out that Mary Queen of Scots is now 14 years old. And throughout this first little segment of the chapter, it's basically just Mary Queen of Scots stating that she thinks that Lymond and Philippa should stay married. So we sort of see her plotting and scheming, which comes back again later in a later chapter, but like this is the beginning of sort of her thoughts. So it's this interesting setup where she's on this side where she wants to see them stay wed to each other. And then you've got Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, who is sort of on the other side and wants Lymond to be married to this Catherine d'Albon, who we were just talking about. And I think that's really going to set up for a bit of a clash that'll come later in the book. So, I don't know, or maybe not. And that is the first little bit of this chapter.
Can I just mention that I am amused that Dorothy Dunnett has managed to make Mary Queen of Scots a Lymond Philippa shipper. Like it's a little much, but it's also fun.
Yeah.
Should I just quick do the rest of the chapter? Or do we want to stop here and talk about this first little segment?
It's up to you, but I wouldn't mind if you just summarize the whole thing because it's pretty short. But
yeah, okay. So in the second part of this chapter, Jarrett and Martha come to Paris. We find out that apparently Paris has been well defended for the possible battle that's coming. At least that's what Jarrett thinks, showing you how observant he is. The most of the day,
was just listening to rumor, right? He was just listening to what the rumor said, which Lymond had directed. So
yeah,
was he actually looking at battlements? I didn't catch that.
Well, for most of the day, he does sort of go around on a tour of the city and its defenses with Lymond, which ends in this sort of like artillery display that looks really nice, but we find out later it's actually only 8 cannons, although he makes it, somehow Lymond fakes it out and makes the Venetian people that are there also think it's a lot more. Anyway, So they go back to the d'Albans, where Lymond is staying. Catherine despises them at first. There's a lot of a talk with Jarrett, and there's a really nice bit where he says he still worries about Martha. And I'm like, that's nice. This is when Lymond sort of tells us, oh, everything you saw is fake. Like, the city is really poor defenses. If they decide to attack, we're basically screwed. So let's hope that that doesn't happen. Lymond actually opens up to Jarrett about sort of his parentage and all of the things that he's worried about as far as that goes. Jarrett lets Lymond know that Martha didn't find any use for that key that she was given, and that she's sending the key along to Sevigny so that Philippa can try it there. And then we find out there's a situation with Calvinists, and the Maréchal de Saint-André is stuck inside the church that is going to be sort of attacked by the soldiers. And Catherine sort of begs for help. She wants to come along. And that is that chapter in a nutshell.
Just to kick it off with the beginning section, when the royalty of France walks from the Sainte-Chapelle to Notre Dame barefoot with the religious relics. For those who have been to Paris, you probably have seen this. This is the Sainte-Chapelle that I'll show. Can you see that?
Now we can.
Yes, okay.
So it's this just ridiculously gorgeous little chapel with these huge stained glass windows, and the rose window, which is also mentioned. When I went with the Lymond group to Paris, this was one of our stops. Although
I've been there too.
Unfortunately, when I was there, the half the windows were under construction or like restoration. So when I was in there, I only got to see like half of it. But yeah, it's super beautiful. So yay.
I appreciated that it took place in Paris, this part, because just like when they were in London and like we were all sort of aware of the geography of the city, I sort of know the geography of Paris. So like when they're talking about Montmartre and the Sacré-Cœur, Notre Dame, like I sort of can see in my mind where all of those places are. So
yeah, same.
I really enjoyed that as well. Just knowing.
It's nice.
Yeah.
Catherine does not have her feet bare. She did not take her shoes off. Does anybody have any idea why they do this? Is this just like a religious thing?
To have bare feet on a procession?
Yeah, for this procession.
It's a sign of humility and like taking on, a low status, and so that before God kind of stuff.
Okay.
Basically saying like God will protect Paris because the royalty has shown this display of humility. Yeah. So Mary, Queen of Scots is now 14. It's been 6 years since we saw her last. What did you guys think of how she's grown and changed?
Well, it was interesting. I thought this bit about because we're in this perspective of Mary Fleming. So she says at the bottom of 128, Mary Fleming looked at the thin, auburn-haired, imperious mistress before her, and drawing on lessons of 9 years of service, realized that, as usual, she had mistaken her courage. Cousin Mary knew of the danger. Cousin Mary was sick with fears for the future, but to display it or to allow her entourage to display it would be less than royal. So you get this sense of this, teenage girl who's both 14, but also well aware of the pressure that she's under, and the way that she presents herself to the world has consequences. And so yeah, it was an interesting juxtaposition of those two things, of like a teenage girl and you get glimpses of that, but also she's the Queen of Scotland. And yeah.
Well, and the stakes are like particularly dire for her because she'd be taken off to Spain and married off, and you know, used as a political pawn and have her life re-wrecked. So
yeah, I mean, her life has been pretty precarious her whole life, so yeah. So random thing, what is being referenced on page 129 where it says on the left was the route at, I don't know, Marmoset, and the cleared space of the house of the Patassier, who had made pies from the flesh of those barbered to death by his neighbor next door, blah, blah, blah. That sounds like Sweeney Todd. Are they like, what?
Yeah.
What is happening?
I assumed that was related somehow to the origin story of Sweeney Todd. I don't know.
Todd? Yeah. I don't know what the origin story of Sweeney Todd is. So I just read that. I'm like, wait a second. What is that? So if anybody knows in the comments, let us know.
A patissier is like a pastry chef or pie chef.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So somebody's like cannibalizing people in pies, which is from a barber.
Maybe Paris has its own sort of version of the Sweeney Todd fable. So
yeah. Who knows? Anyway, that just sort of threw me out of the story for a second. I was like, wait a second, what?
Knowing Dunnett, there's definitely some real historical reference that she's referring to.
It's like, hey, they walked past this building and here's the historical thing that happened in this building. So let's put it in the book.
I also liked how, like, of course they're carrying the crown of thorns, the sponge, and the lance head from when Jesus died. Really?
Sure.
That's like, really? I don't think you are.
But in the point of view of everyone whose point of view we're in,
right?
Of course they are. Just like the round
table. It was kind of like the Knights of the Round Table was in the last book. Yep. It is interesting that Mary says about Philippa that she has no flaw. Like that was one of the things that she says about Philippa, that she has manners, breeding, education, I grant you, but he'll marry her not for these, but her fortune, talking about Catherine. His present wife has no flaw. You can see, you're like, well, maybe not.
You know, I think, I don't know if she
means from her perspective,
a flawless human being, but she means, you know, this is a great wife.
Yeah. She has money, she has land, she's cultured, she's got like why are you divorcing her? She's great. Yeah.
I like that after 6 years, Mary Queen of Scots still holds Lymond in such high esteem.
Well, yeah, you can see, because it kind of comes back when they meet again. She's comparing him now to her memories, but in her memory, he was this figure that made a great impression on her as a child, which like I totally get that, because I remember like some of my cousins who I saw when I was really little, I always like idealized them, and then when I met them later, I was like, oh, you're so different now that I'm older, right? But the way they interact with a kid is totally different than a little kid is totally different than how they're going to interact with you when you're a teenager.
And I would imagine she still thinks he's a loyal Scotsman, so like that she can sort of, you know, use him to her advantage and get things done. Because I doubt that she's had much time to talk to the Queen Dowager and find out sort of what's happened between her and Lymond. So,
well, and there's definitely, they allude to the fact that there's talk of her marrying Lymond, like Mary. Like there's, because she mentions about how one of the good things about him staying married is that he wouldn't be divorced and have, and there's reference to some people would be happy if the Queen of Scotland was married to one of her own noblemen. So that has been bandied about, which is, ugh.
Well, he'd be better for her than Darnley. Ugh.
That's true. That is true.
That is true. She does end up married to Bothwell after Darnley, but that sounds sort of like it could be a kidnapping rape situation. Anyway,
I will say there's a terrible TV show which I absolutely do not recommend, because I only watched like 5 episodes of it, that's based around Mary Queen of Scots in the French court, called Reign, and like all the Marys there's like a whole bunch of Marys that are her attendants or whatever, and they're the main characters. Anyway, all I could see in my head was like this bad costuming from that TV show, which has terrible costuming and it's horribly inauthentic. And so, yeah.
I tried watching it once, but I'm like,
it's really bad.
Real history is so interesting. Why do you have to like put all this fake stuff in there? So
it was like Gossip Girl meets history or something. It's not good.
Yeah, that's why, because the sort of crowd that they're going for probably doesn't care too much about real history.
No. I think I made it 4 or 5 episodes and I was like, I cannot anymore with this show. Anyway.
So I like how she foreshadows the upcoming conflict on page 133, where like they're at dinner and one of the guys has to leave halfway through to deal with rumors of an impending clash in the university quarter. Mm-hmm. She just kind of buries that in there, and then then we realize later like that's the next couple chapters or the next
mm-hmm.
chapter.
Yeah, I did like Jarrett notices halfway down 133, it's just this atmosphere he does. He says there was about it all an air of orderly, intensive creation, which was acutely familiar. And I just liked that idea that Lymond is surrounded by intensive creation, that there was this feeling in the air.
Archie gives a powerful hint for Jarrett to go back with Lymond on page 135.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Yep. I underlined it and then didn't go back to it. Does he want Jarrett to find out what's really going on? At that point, did Jarrett know what was really going on in Paris?
Well, no, he does find that out from talking to Lymond. But why would Archie want Jarrett to find that out?
I think it's partly that he just wants another person there keeping their eye on Lymond and making sure that he's safe and protected. I mean, Archie's sort of taken on this sort of like protector role. He always has been, but he's been separated from Lymond for so long. And now that he's back, the headaches are there, the, occasional blindness. So maybe he just wants another person that he trusts there to have an eye on Lymond at all times.
I mean, there's this bit on 142 where Jarrett is looking at Archie and he says Jarrett had never noticed before how the little man studied Francis. The bright black eyes and the lined face covered every inch of his body and face, from his unchanged clothes to his hand by the half-empty wine cup. Francis, although his words were not addressed to Archie, had his eyes fixed on him in return. So it was just this little bit about how focused Archie is on Lymond. So it could be that he wanted, like what Philippe said, that he wanted someone else to be paying attention.
I will also note that right after that part you just read, the next bit is, "It's 1 o'clock, Jarrett," said Lymond softly. "Marta will long since have been asleep." I think I mentioned before that the time thing is a hint to whether Lymond is having an episode or not. And in this case, by saying it's 1 o'clock, he's also telling Archie, "I'm not blind because I can read the clock. I'm not having an episode right now."
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like Archie's studying him to see if he's ill.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he's looking so closely.
Yeah. Yep.
I also, by the way, right above that, quite enjoy Jarrett observing that Lymond has a hand finer than Marta's.
I noticed
my commander is hotter than my wife.
He's got such delicate hands.
It's just cracks because it's a Jarrett point of view thing. Like Jarrett sees Lymond as attractive, and he's so repressed about it.
So repressed.
So repressed that he married basically his twin in woman form.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jared also mentions, they're talking about his drinking, and Jared's like, have you ever seen me drunk in the field? Meaning he can control it when he needs to. And Lyman's response is, sometimes the bedchamber is the field. It's very true.
Yeah.
Jared and Martha.
Yeah. Like Jared, just because Jared isn't drinking while he's at war doesn't mean he's not drinking when he shouldn't be. That was my kind of question about wouldn't Jared, I was a little confused about why Jared didn't pick up on the fakeness of the Parisian defense, because isn't he supposed to be super competent in war? Like, isn't that one of the things about Jared, is that he's really incompetent in lots of things, but the thing that he does well is war and battle. And so I was a little bit confused about, like, were they just showing him the things that he wouldn't pick up on purpose, or was he drunk and being oblivious, or like, which it didn't seem to be that.
I think it was more a commentary on Lyman's ability to effectively fake things than on Jared's observation skills, because I think, basically that. I don't necessarily think it's a comment on Jared. I think it's a comment on Lymond.
There's also a lot in this section sort of describing how exhausted Jared is. So maybe he just misses a couple of these things, because it's the same day that he's traveled from Lyon. He goes right from sort of dropping Martha off at wherever they're staying to spending all day touring the city with Lymond. And there's the point where when they go back to the hotel, even in Jared's point of view, he's like, if I sit for too long, I will fall asleep. And he does, actually, after they sort of have finished talking. But
it's also true that it's not his responsibility to, like, he's not judging Paris to either defend or attack it. So it's not, that could be part of it too, is he's not paying.
I mean, I think there's also an obvious metatextual reason, which is that it needs to be revealed to the reader, and Jared's there as like the reader substitute, to have it revealed to.
Yeah, good point. I do like that the description of how extreme all this is. Like, they've got all of this like physical fake stuff that they're faking, and then they're intercepting all of these spy reports and sending like different ones, and they're doing, like, it's just this is an elaborate ruse, which is kind of fun to see play out.
Well, and it's such a Lymond thing. Like, this is his motif, going back to the sheeps with the helmets,
Yeah.
He's so good at the faking things in order as like a strategic tool in his toolbox. And I also like that they even managed to plant a few evil portents, screaming devils that scare the German.
Yes. I'm also a little bit curious. I feel like we're often curious about the real historical stuff when we read these books, but I'm curious about the real historical reason why King Philip didn't attack Paris, because obviously he didn't, and I don't think ever does. Like, Paris is not threatened again. And so obviously Lymond wasn't historically there to do this, but I'm sort of wondering, like, was this something that someone did? Did they have this big fake defense of Paris, and that's why Philip didn't move his armies forward? Or if somebody knows, write in the comments.
I think it almost says it later in a later chapter, how like a lot of the Spanish armies got caught up taking some of the outskirts so that they weren't as well sort of supplied. And then also there was a large portion of Italian soldiers that came and helped bolster the city just in a little bit.
Right. But I'm curious if this fake defense of Paris was a real thing.
Oh, right.
And if Dunnett like pulled this from history, or if she sort of added to it by making Lymond do this.
Yeah, I am curious about the real history. I think there's probably some root of truth in it, but maybe it's not as elaborate as in this, just because Lymond wasn't actually there, but who knows. But I found that there's a parallel with this, and like there's a part in the first book where the English have a chance to attack Edinburgh, and if they were to do it, they clearly would have taken it, but they don't. But then when you see it from their side, like they've got supply train problems, and politics in London aren't sending them enough soldiers, whatever. And it's like the same thing here, where you know, if Philip had really just gone all in, he could have taken Paris, but like he's got his own problems with mercenaries deserting and stuff. So
Right.
from that side, with all the uncertainties, they don't know that like this is my one chance to take Paris, and if I don't, I never will, you know.
Right. History's always 2020 hindsight. So
Yeah.
I did like also that Lymond mentions that he is trying to find Fergie and Alec, that they haven't just abandoned them to their captivity or whatever's happened, but everything possible is being done to find them.
I hope they're okay.
I know.
I hope we find out at some point. That would suck if their fates are just never really revealed. So
yeah, or if they just die off screen.
She does do a lot of that, doesn't she?
Gideon.
Yeah.
And Dongan, no more.
Dongan. Oh, we knew you so well.
Yeah.
There's a great little bit about Marshal de Saint-André on 136 that it doesn't have anything to do with the book, but I just want to read it out loud because it's so droll and it's like shady, like it's her ship throwing shade. A pair of oak doors made their appearance in the lamplight, whose panels, beneath the coat of arms of the d'Albon family, gave a stirring account of the siege of Troy, at which the Marshal de Saint-André would no doubt have been present had the event not occurred prematurely. It made me laugh out loud. I loved it.
I laughed at that. And there's another comment later about how the cardinal, something about the Pope did something. Oh, it's when it's about the celebration in Rome at the end of some war or something. And it says like the Pope is celebrating whatever. And it was an unfortunate oversight of the Pope's immediate superior that caused, and basically like God was sleeping on the job and a rainstorm happened, but it was like this lovely droll sort of like something about the Pope's immediate superior, meaning God.
And that God's oversight caused it to rain and flood the wine cellars.
Wine cellars, right?
They couldn't keep drinking.
Right. Like clearly God just wasn't paying attention. Otherwise there wouldn't have been a rainstorm that flooded the wine cellars.
Yeah, that's correct, you know.
That's funny.
Okay, so just last few things in this chapter. There's some talk about Marta's identity that I think is interesting. When Lymond is talking to Jared about why he married her, and Jared agrees that he did want to give her a position, and Lymond's response is she has a position, marriage has weakened it, she's fighting not to lose it altogether. And then they talk about she requires to be taught, not to be worshipped, and is Jared the person to do it? What is your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. I think part of it is Jarrett's just kind of patriarchal assumption that like to be a wife and mother is the best role that a woman can, like he wants to, I think he genuinely loves Marta and he wants to do something good for her. And in his eyes, being married to him is like the best position that she can have. It's an improvement over her position. And Lymond and Marta, I think, like, no, that's not necessarily true, that women can have a life out of that and outside of that. And so this like marriage has weakened her position. Like, of course it has, because she no longer interacts with the world as her own person. She now interacts with the world as a subset of Jarrett. And that is, or at least socially, that would be the way it would happen. And if she wants to interact with the world as her own person, she's going to have to fight for that. And that's what's mentioned in the text, you know, that marriage has weakened her position and she's fighting not to lose it altogether, and probably fighting not to be like subsumed inside this marriage as opposed to her own, hey River, her own person. But that she requires to be taught, not to be worshipped. I don't know. I mean, the implication is like she wants to learn things, which is true, but I think it's a little like at least Jarrett's realizing he's not the person to do it, because it would be super arrogant of him to be like, well, let me teach you. Just
well, I think it's a question of what does she require to be taught. And the best interpretation that I have of that is she needs to be taught how to connect openly, like with another person, because it's so hard for her to build relationships. So like if there's anything that she needs to learn, it's how to kind of let down her walls and have a real relationship with someone, which she did at the end of Pawn. Because of all the trauma and stress and everything, like her walls came down for a moment, but now they're back up. So if like I like that's the only interpretation I can think of that kind of makes sense, but like I don't know if it's right, because I don't know if there's enough in this particular exchange to really indicate what Lymond is referring to.
well, I can see the like not being worshipped as a way to say like that's not trustworthy from her perspective. Like if Jarrett comes at her as like, I love you, you're amazing, you're this, you know, you're the only woman for me, whatever, like that's not trustworthy from her perspective. Like that's not I can see her like just not trusting him when he says like effusive, over the top comments that would be worshipful.
But not only that,
but yet
you can't build a real relationship that way. You can't build a real human connection that way. You're just putting up another kind of wall.
Yeah. So yeah, and worship implies distance, right? That there's and not equals. Yeah, but then teaching implies that too, like to use a metaphor for teaching. Yeah, it implies an unequal relationship, and a relationship that's somewhat distant as well. So I don't know.
It's a weird term to use, especially because should Jarrett really be teaching anybody anything? Because he's so much more capable and competent than him. But I do think like the one thing he is definitely more capable and competent in than she is his open-heartedness, I guess, which he doesn't necessarily utilize all that well, but it's that kind of core trait that, like, you know, Lymond just kept him around. Remember that, like, I don't think I can do this without you exchange that they had. So
yeah, at least Jarrett realizes that he's not that he shouldn't be teaching Marta things, like point in his favor.
I also like how he says he wants to get her out of that house. You'd think the house is still alive, which, like, for unobservant Jarrett, even he notices, like, this isn't very healthy.
Not at all.
No, not when you're dressing up like your grandmother and pretending to do stuff. Yeah. Although I don't know if she knows that the Dame du Détente was her grandmother. Right. We can talk about that when we get there.
Yeah. We also have the talk about the incident where Lymond and Philippa had the chase in the previous chapter that we read, and Jarrett says, at any rate, you and Philippa dodged them. No real damage was done. And Lymond says, no real damage was done. And that just stood out to me because I think Lymond, probably his actual opinion is the opposite.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's just it's such a pattern of Jarrett just misreading situations and making assumptions about things, misreading situations, making these like broad pronouncements about the way things are that are totally wrong.
I mean, in his defense, how's Jarrett going to know that, like, that whole thing caused Philippa to fall in love with Lymond? I also like the recurrence or reappearance of Nick Applegarth, who's the, like, caretaker of 70, who we met briefly in Queen's Play. I don't know if we met him or if we just heard about him.
He's been mentioned before, but I don't know if he's been sort of on screen.
But I like how she just has her continuity down so well.
She has a number of callbacks in these chapters. Like Jenny Fleming gets mentioned, and the fact that she's got King Henry's bastard son.
He's 5 years old now.
He's apparently a Marine.
who's the other characters that they talked about that I was like, oh, we haven't heard about them in a while. I forget, but when we get there, I'll bring it up.
Anything else on this chapter?
I don't.
I do think it's funny that Jarrett assumed that Catherine d'Albon was worried about a lover, and it's actually her mother that she's worried about, which I thought was somewhat Jarrett-esque. To be like, oh, it's a lover, an admirer. It's like, no, you
cynical and judgmental Jarrett.
Her mother's in danger. So, anyway.
I remembered the other callback. In chapter 3, and we'll get to it, they talk about sort of what's happening in Malta, and the new Knight of the Grand Order passed away, and they think La Valette is going to be the new one, which we know historically is true. So, but just touching about, stuff that happened in old books and sort of bringing it back to the forefront again. I feel like there's going to be a lot more of that throughout this book as well.
I think that's one thing I like about this location, about the fact that they're in France, is that it's easy for Dunnett to pull in these characters that we know or remember from previous books, particularly Queen's Play. But it's just nice to see what's going on with people, and I like that.
Oh, for sure. And certainly at the final book of a series like this, you want to wrap up with all kinds of updates, conclusions and stuff.
Yeah. Give us updates. Who's doing what? Okay.
So chapter 2, the congregation in the church is trying to sort of fight its way out. They decide that that's their best course of action. And right when things are about to get really bad, the Duke Charles de Guise, certainly the Cardinal Charles de Guise, shows up and sort of gives this rousing speech like, no, let them pass, stop the fighting. Like, we will corral them and bring them to their punishment, but there needs to be no more death. Charles de Guise is actually in Rome right now, but nobody seems to understand that because they all think it's him. And of course, it's Lymond in disguise. So he rescues La Marchal and the woman that she's with, who is the wife of another guy that got captured in the San Quentin raid. They sort of all dress up in costume. Catherine d'Albon is with them, and they're sort of like making their way around the town as to hide the fact that Marchal was in this Calvinist church gathering. They end up going to see Joseph and Moses, who we find out Joseph is an old professor of Lymond's at the school that he went to in France. At least that's what I think.
I don't know if he was a professor or he was more of a groundskeeper servant type role, but he was someone who was in a caretaker role when Lymond went to school there. Yeah.
And new Lymond is like a young troublemaker.
Yes. Lymond does eventually get everyone back to the Hotel de Saint Andre, and of course Lady Marchal immediately wants Catherine to clean up and put on her finest looks for the next day, because I think she is now even more enamored with the fact that she wants Lymond to marry her daughter. She's sort of agreeing with it now, and I think this is the beginning of when Catherine is sort of falling for Lymond as well.
Yeah, I actually think it's a little bit sad for the Marchal. She realizes that it's past her time and that her daughter is taking the stage now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's this huge melancholy section about aging as a woman at the end of this chapter that I thought was really good and sad.
Yeah. So did your Lymond imposter syndrome alert go off? When did you figure out that was Lymond?
Yeah,
pretty
fast.
Yeah. I know.
Basically, it was too convenient. I was like, wait a second.
We haven't spent much with Charles de Guise. I know he was in book 2 quite a bit, but it just didn't seem to scan with what he would have actually done in this case. So I was like, something's fishy.
Also, why in the world is the Cardinal coming to this? No.
Plus, we already knew that Lymond was on his way to try and save the situation, so.
Yeah.
I did like the little description at the beginning of how the Marchal ended up there, which is basically her friend sort of convinced her, and then another high up noble convinced her. that you can't rely on confession, you gotta be one of the elect. So this idea of how Protestantism is at this point sort of a word of mouth underground thing that's happening amongst the powerful people. I could just see my mom doing the exact same thing. Like, my friend told me I needed to be saved, so I went to the gathering, because it's like so dangerous. But
yeah, and just there's a little bit that says the Marshal de Saint Andre was from time to time much aware of her need for salvation, and just that is a genuine motivating factor. And I think today we don't often think about like hell as a motivating factor. Like, people talk about it in some circles and things like that, but I think at least in the circles I run in, like, that is not motivating people. Like, you know, like, I might end up in hell is not something that people really think about, but it was a really big deal at this time. And I think we forget about how much the afterlife was so much a part of people's daily life, like thinking about the afterlife and what would happen then. And that was a really like significant part of your mental process. That it's interesting.
I'm always fascinated by the art, which is, I think, a little before this time, but like the medieval art that you'll see of hell. Like, I remember when I was in Florence in this church with all these just huge murals of sinners being tortured in hell, and demons doing all kinds of horrifying things. And like, to me, it's hilarious. But back then it was like, oh, this is serious. Like, you don't want to end up there.
The triptych by Hieronymus Bosch, Garden of Earthly Delights, is one of my favorite pieces of art ever, because it's so batshit crazy, but like, it's so detailed too, and that reminds me of that. So
I'm also super intrigued by historical artistic renderings, particularly of the fall, that seem to really be an excuse for the artist to draw really good looking naked people. like a lot of the times, like, the fall is just like super attractive, like people and demons, and then bad stuff is happening to them. But you're kind of like, that's interesting.
Well, the whole Saint Sebastian thing, which is basically an excuse to draw a super hot guy writhing around in agony.
Yeah. So true.
Anyway,
it's like, it's okay to depict naked people as long as they're sad or being tortured.
Yeah, or as long as it's telling a biblical story, you're just being.
For religious purposes, it's okay.
Also, how come everybody's naked in the biblical things? Like, it's like there's this perception that like Old Testament people didn't wear clothes. I don't think that's true. But anyway,
humans are funny.
Yes.
Okay, so this is actually one of my favorite parts of the book, is when we have Lymond revisiting his school days. And part of why I love it is it gives us this view of him that we actually never got before, because it's the view of him as almost an adult, not quite an adult, but almost, but before all the really bad trauma, before Margaret Lennox happened. So the idea that he's this legendary troublemaker that the kids are still telling stories about. I just love. And again, reminds me of The Untamed, and how at the beginning Wei Wuxian is such a delightfully charismatic, troublemaking teenager before all the terrible stuff happens.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, just that
it's like every. No, go.
Well, just you love that, you can love that version of them and then be really sad that they've been so traumatized that they can't be that. But then those bits still come out where like Lymond dresses up or whatever, and you're like, oh, it's still there underneath. And actually, as a teenager, if he just stayed that way, he'd have been very annoying. So like maybe the trauma in a way helped him grow up into a better person.
Yeah. It reminded me of like every movie I've seen about a boys' school, there's always that like super charismatic guy who's always dragging everyone into trouble, and it's like every single film that you've ever seen or play or anything about a boys' school, there's always that character. And yeah.
And just the way she slowly introduces it where he's like looking at the wall and he's like, do you think they remodeled that recently? And then he climbs up what looks like a sheer wall, and it's like, oh, because he went to school there and he learned all the tricks. He knows exactly where the footholds are. And then the way the guy Joseph is like the master of Coulter, so this memory of him as, you know, his old title, who he used to be, that was how we were introduced to him in the first book, and like that's not who he is anymore, and they don't even know that he's this general guy that's come in. Like they're just still remembering him as this teenage troublemaker.
Was actually before they sort of say who Joseph is, I was trying to figure out if he was a character from a previous book, like if he was like one of his band of men in the first book. And I was like, is this somebody's? I know Turkey Matt died, but like there were others, so I know.
Well, just also the way that Lymond was his troublemaker, but he made friends. He was a very likable troublemaker. So even this person in a position of authority who like beat him for messing up his shoes or whatever also like remembers him very fondly, and they had a good relationship.
I would like to know what this mathematical proposition spelled.
I know.
Or Orontius Phineas.
It's like making like the word boobs on your calculator or something. You know, I mean, just as a teacher, like I know that kid. Like I have that student. Like every year, there's that student that as a teacher you just adore them because they're funny and they're charismatic and they're always doing stuff that makes you mad because they're getting in trouble and they're like trying to get other people in trouble and it's like derailing your lesson, but at the same time you're like, you really like them because they're just a good, you know, they're a good kid at heart, and like you just, yeah, like that student shows up all the time, and you're like, you've just got to focus and you'll be okay. You know, but, yeah.
And I think of it in terms of also like what it tells us about Lymond or this character archetype in general, which is like so many ideas, not enough space for them to come out, not respecting of propriety, but not bad or hurt in a hurtful way, just wanting to push boundaries and just be so interested in everything that they want to go in a whole bunch of different directions. And then I think with Wei Wuxian and maybe also with Lymond, there's also this part of them that's like, I will be the troublemaker, so I'm not a threat to my brother, who's like the heir and the stable one. So it's also sort of a defense mechanism and a way of making themselves less threatening and more like, oh, they're just the funny, you know, charismatic bad kid, not a real threat to the powerful heir, because actually in both cases they're like way more competent than their brother, and could be a threat if they really like seriously pursued, you know,
right,
whatever.
I think there's also an element of like, I'm gonna cause trouble and be funny so that I'm directing the narrative about myself instead of like getting in trouble for things that are more serious or different. Or I mean, a lot of times I think that student or that young person who's so vocal about causing trouble or being funny is really trying to change the story about them in some way or direct the story about them, and often it's like, I'm going to make fun of myself so that you can't insult me by making fun of me in a different way. And
no, for sure. And you can see exactly where that comes from, with, you know, the Lymond being rejected by his father, like wanting to change that story around and be the troublemaker and be rejected for being a troublemaker rather than be rejected for being himself.
right.
Which is a lot of like deep stuff to get into in a what is actually just a hilarious little section of like, is this thing true? Is this thing true? Did you really put whatever in all the professor's boots?
Yeah.
And then when the ladies from Glatigny were invited, oh no, we're done.
Yeah.
I probably pronounced that wrong.
Yeah. I thought it was so interesting. So we get to sort of this bit about the Marshal on 155, where Catherine is helping her to wipe off her makeup. And it says, the water was refreshing. It was like a masquerade. Madame La Marchal remembered an occasion when she's just thinking back to when she's put on pretend before, but it's this idea that her real face is never shown, and so it's the masquerade, whereas her cosmetic face is the face that she shows everyone. And so that just that and she's aging, and it gets more into it at the end of this chapter, but that like she hasn't really dealt with the fact that she's aging, I don't think, and that this comes as a revelation in some ways to her and to her daughter, because there's this bit about her body and how like without the structure of the clothes that she wears, her body looks different, and her daughter's kind of shocked by the difference in her body and the fact that it's aged and is not shapely the way it was, and that her face has been damaged by the cosmetics she wears and by age and all of those things, and that's what we face as we get older. So yeah. Anyway.
I don't know. I think it's interesting in a bunch of ways. Like, it's interesting because La Marchal has been portrayed as such a kind of shallow, one-dimensional character, and then we get this very real and kind of moving bit with her. So, in that respect, it's just Dunnett proving her chops as a writer to give us this depth for this one-dimensional side. Yeah. It also tells us about Lymond that we already knew, but like he did not sleep with her for sexy times. Like it was a very conscious, like, I don't want to marry her daughter, so I'll sleep with her. Like it's very calculated. And that also he sleeps with people without regard for whether he's attracted to them. Like it's like not even a consideration. Sex for him is always for like a transactional reason, basically, nowadays. Yeah. And also just like I think it's just really interesting the way it's sort of like the Marshal passing the torch to her daughter, and kind of like this part of her that's accepting that she's not the beautiful young woman anymore. She's older and it's her daughter. And this is kind of where she reconciles herself to the idea of Lymond marrying her daughter.
And there's this power transfer in it as well, you know, that so much of the influence that women had, and in many ways still have, is based on their physical appearance. And if you lose that, and if it diminishes, or if you never had it to begin with, then there's a loss of power and a loss of influence, and your life materially changes when that fades. And it's a sad reality that you know is based on a lot of things, but you know, whatever the cultural, if you fit the cultural norm of beauty, you will not fit that for long, basically, you know.
Yeah. Well, I like Dunnett's like just conscious awareness of it as a reality, like, because I think about it in terms of like, why do I wear makeup? I'm not wearing it for me. That's bullshit. Like, I'm wearing it. It eases my way through the world. It makes my life a little easier, you know?
Yeah, I think this is probably not true for everyone, but for me, yeah, makeup and dress and fashion are incredibly performative. You know, it's who do I present to the world, and what do I look like when I leave my apartment? And that is very much part of the narrative of what are the norms of beauty of our society, and how can I fit into those, or push back against them in some ways, but usually fit into them.
At least for me, I use them to my advantage. Like, they're going to be there regardless. Like, because originally when I was a teenager, I was like, this is all crap. I don't want to participate in it at all. And then I was like, all right, I can't, it's going to be there regardless of me. So can I use it to my advantage?
Yeah.
River agreed.
Yeah. And I didn't participate in it for much of my late teens and 20s. And then there was a point in my late 20s where I was like, I'm going to like aggressively perform this this very particular kind of femininity. And I had a lot of fun with it through like my 20s and 30s. And now it's coming to that, I am coming to that revelation, I guess, that's like, I don't fit it anymore as much. I'm just older. And I think the pandemic in a lot of ways has made me see that, like, that has, I don't know, I'm kind of coming to the same realizations that this character is coming to in the book, which is I don't fit those norms very much. I'm almost 50 years old. Like, those are things that are passing me by, which, yeah, it's weird. It's a weird, real revelation to have. It's, yeah. Like this chapter kind of hit me in weird ways, but yeah.
Okay, moving on, just a couple other things in this chapter that stood out to me. Lymond, someone tried to duck him in the fountain, and he retaliated with the abandon of a man who had been throwing other men into water for the greater part of his life.
Yeah.
We've seen it happen.
She's just got so many lines like that. You know, she just carries her wit in these long paragraphs, and you're like, oh my God, she's so clever.
Yeah.
And then there's also a line about this is Lymond's observation about what's happening. You know, the city's nervous about being attacked, and any country which has suffered a reverse of fortune instantly turns on its nonconformists. Like, yep, we see that all the time.
Totally. I also thought, I also loved his line about there is no missionary as persuasive as death. It's just like, yeah. And the church knows that already. Yeah. And
just the way we end with Catherine, also Lymond giving this sort of beautiful prayer, and Catherine's tears coming down and realizing like, oh, poor Catherine has just gone through exactly what Philippa just went through, and now she's in love with Lymond, and that never seems to work out well for anyone.
She realizes it a lot more quickly than Philippa did, though.
Yeah, the whole thing, this whole chapter of Catherine is just like an abbreviated version of Philippa's entire story in like one chapter.
I did like the fact that horns of unicorns are something that we need to be delivered from by God.
I'm sure this, I mean, obviously this is a real text. I don't know the source.
Yeah. I love it. Lions' mouths and horns of unicorns.
All right, shall we move on to chapter 3?
All right, let me get the notes. So, Paris most likely won't be attacked. Yay, we don't have to worry about that. A lot of this chapter is through Danny's point of view. He's sort of come back into the city. So my handwriting is terrible. I don't even know what I wrote here. So I'm going to just pick and choose what I can. Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller has died. So Lavalette is now probably the next person. Sort of at the end of the chapter, they visit Mary Queen of Scots. See, I can't recognize half of what I wrote here. And Jenny Fleming is mentioned and her kid. And then Mary Queen of Scots wants him to stay married to Philippa. And then sort of at the end of the chapter, sorry, again, I didn't take very good notes. Lymond enters a room that the queen sends him into, and Nostradamus is in the room with Philippa. So he thinks that Philippa has gone to England and that she is once again out of his life for the moment, but here she is. And it's a little surprise that Mary Queen of Scots set up because she ships them. Apologies, I didn't realize my handwriting was that terrible for this section, but I think I did this the other night when I was tired. So
you got the gist of it, it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. That's what happened. Yeah, here was this line about God sleeping on the job, where it's the celebrations only ceased when, through an oversight possibly of the Pope's immediate superior, the river Tiber flooded and Rome was inundated to a depth of 6 feet, including the wine cellars. It's like, oh, God was sleeping on the job.
Oh, good.
I was just gonna say, and we also know that the King of France is massively rewarding Lymond, which is obviously politically significant. He's now in the Order of Saint Michel. Is that what it is?
Yeah. I think this is interesting because what we're seeing is like the rise of Lymond as a power in France, which is happening to him entirely without his wanting it or planning for it or trying to make it happen. It is entirely the powers in France going, this guy is super useful. We need to keep him here. Let's,
right.
I think he calls it later like golden chains.
Golden chains, yeah.
Yeah, like let's throw all these honors at him. Let's throw this rich heiress at him. Let's do everything to keep him to stay and work for us, because we need like, we need someone with a skill set, basically.
And all he wants to do is go back to Russia.
and you know, it's just so funny because everybody else is like, I'm sure looking at him like, what the hell? You know, I've been trying to get power forever. Why is this guy got all this power and he doesn't even want it?
Yep.
And I forget his word in the point of view, like I guess it was the French ambassador to Istanbul, maybe, and so just observing like this was a man to be cultivated, and he knew who would be glad to have warning of it. So other people seeing his power start to rise.
I mean, which is again just a comment on why Lymond doesn't want it. You know, like this. It's because then he just turns into a man to be cultivated, which is used and, you know, used for purpose and thrown away, and that's not what he wants. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because, like, if we think about what he wants out of his life, does it really make that much difference if he's a power in France versus in Russia? But I guess in Russia, he really thinks he can make a big difference for the people and the greater good of the nation, whereas in France, it's just a lot of political maneuvering. Yeah. And he's not super invested in France the way he used to be in Scotland. So, yeah. Okay, so there's one of my... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think he thinks the people in France are fine and don't really need his help, where in Russia, there's a real sort of drive to like pull the people out of the poverty that they're in and raise them up by educating them, you know, the ways of the West and things like that.
Yeah, or even if France is in danger, like he's not super invested in it either way. Like England takes some land or Spain takes some land or whatever, but like the French court is super corrupt, and what's the point of, I don't know, getting involved, I guess.
I did notice the Queen mentions his grandfather.
Yes. Page 166.
Yep.
I remember well my uncle of Albany praising the abilities of your grandfather.
Yep. So again, like Lymond just keeps not forgetting that his grandfather was around. And so I don't know. And then I loved this bit about Danny Hislop where it says his mood was sardonic, short, ugly, sharp as a razor. Danny Hislop, the bishop's byblow from Ayrshire, had owned no superior before joining Lymond in Moscow and still struggled from time to time against the knowledge that in Francis Crawford he had perhaps met his match. I love that there's a perhaps in there. Oh, Danny.
Danny has also one of my favorite lines in the next page, 167. Danny Hislop, who was an unstinting admirer of Jarrett's appearance, his wife, and his reputation, was still to be overwhelmed by his acumen.
Yeah.
He remains thirsty, though, for good old Jarrett.
Jarrett is so hot, but man, he's dumb.
He's so dumb.
He's not that dumb. He's just not, he doesn't have acumen. He's not observant.
Yeah. Right. He's smart in some things.
He's smart in military tactics, but in terms of like people picking up the nuances of people, I mean, he was brainwashed by Gabriel for how long?
I mean, granted, a lot of people were brainwashed by Gabriel, so, but Jared's particularly unobservant about people. Like,
well, the whole like Lymond sacrificing himself to save Jarrett from like sexual assault, and Jarrett thinking that Lymond was like having a whole bunch of fun with the Agamemnon.
Yeah.
So
also, I love that he refers to Marta as the angelic Marta.
Angelic in her face.
Yeah, the angelic Marta, of course, the viper-tongued, glorious stepsister. Like, great.
But this is really interesting because when we first met Danny, there was a lot of like suspicion of Danny being bad, and now Danny has his eye on Archie and is suspicious of Archie. What do you think is going on there?
I refuse to believe that Archie is bad.
No, there's no way.
What's going on?
I wonder if Danny is picking up like on how focused Archie is on Lymond, and just Archie is probably paying an inordinate amount of attention to Lymond, and if he's helping Lymond cover for his episodes, then Archie's probably doing some things that seem a little weird to people around them. So I wonder if Danny's picking up on some of that.
Well, and so we have Danny's memory of that night that we ended the first section of the book on, which he remembers a detail that we didn't hear before, which is that Lymond had a clean contusion at the back of his head. And Archie said he lost his footing. So he came in super drunk and had to be carried in, and his head was bleeding. Do we know?
I mean, we know that he was having one of his episodes that night, but Danny doesn't. Right. Danny doesn't know about the episodes, as far as I know. So,
also, like, super bad migraine could come off to an observer as super drunk, like being incoherent because of alcohol or being incoherent because of pain may look the same from the outside. So, yeah.
I mean, I think it's just the fact that Danny's relationship with Lymond is so different than Archie's, because Danny is an underling. He's a one to be commanded, and that's always been the relationship. There is some friendship there. There is trust that has grown. But like this new guy, Archie, just shows up and he sees immediately how Lymond trusts him and doesn't really order him around. Like, Archie is just there to sort of do, like, Archie almost has this paternal relationship with Lymond that I've always felt, which is really interesting because we know how Lymond does with father-like figures. Not very well.
Yeah. I have to say, I also think of Archie as a mother-like figure in terms of the way he, sort of takes care of Lymond. Is sort of a stereotypical mom thing to do.
He must be a Cancer.
Maybe he is. But I love how their social roles, Archie's so far below, he's this low-class servant guy, but like in terms of their actual roles, yeah, he doesn't take any crap from Lymond. He's much more in a parental position.
Yeah, and Lymond like asks him to do things, and Archie may do it and he may not. Like you kind of get the sense that Archie will do it if he thinks it's in Lymond's best interest, then he'll do it, and otherwise maybe he won't. And I love also that he sort of has so much agency. Like Archie is he Lymond's man or is he Philippe's man? And it's his choice who he gives his loyalty to and all of that.
Yeah. He's pretty much just not going to take any crap from Lymond. There's also a wonderful exchange on 170 where Lymond's going off and he says, none of my people are coming with me. Jared and Archie are not coming, nor Danny. But he was wrong in one respect. Archie did not stay, but appeared at his side without comment. Challenged, he merely opened his black eyes and said that if Mr. Crawford was going to play at being a knight, then Mr. Crawford would need a squire to hold up his petticoats for him. It's just like, yeah, he refused to be ordered around. He's going to be where he's going to be, and Lymond's just going to have to live with it.
Just deal with it. I also love this little tiny comment on 169 where He was thankful to find that Lymond was off with a party of German pioneers doing something inexplicable with a couple of carts spread with tarpaulins. And it was just like this, like, she doesn't have to tell us what's going on. We don't know what the details of that are, but clearly it's some sort of really inventive, crazy thing that Lymond does, like the sheep with the helmets. And we just know, oh, he's doing something crazy and inventive, and it's going to help, deceive somebody about something. So
yeah, and Jarrett sleeps for 6 hours, during which time Lymond comes back and then leaves again to go do another thing.
Right, do another thing that will help with whatever.
And he's poisoned some wells, among other things.
Oh, right, he's making the water undrinkable. Yeah.
There's also a part where what's happening here? I highlighted. Jarrett says we all get out of condition at times and moves off. Danny, gazing after him critically, was aware of a twinge of approval. He hoped that nothing about him revealed it.
Yeah.
Cracks me up.
Oh, these men. They just don't want they don't want to show their true selves.
Well, Danny certainly doesn't.
No.
He's got a reputation to maintain.
That's right. He's got to be cynical.
Yeah. He wears his cynicism as his own kind of mask in a way. He definitely cares by now. So we spent some time on Mary, Queen of Scots' point of view, and I did find it really interesting, like how she feels sort of left out because she doesn't get as much fancy stuff as the other princesses because she doesn't have as much money. And how in her memory, Jenny Fleming was this, shining star, the best governess she ever had. And it's been so boring since Jenny left, which totally makes sense when you're a kid. Like, that is the kind of person you want to be your governess, the one that takes you on adventures and helps you break the rules and sneaks you candy.
Right.
She's the one that put her on that boat that almost drowned, the firework boat.
Yes, and
sure.
And kept the candy that was poison.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Irresponsible, but not malicious.
No.
And fun.
Yeah, and fun. Yeah.
I know, like, Dee, it was just so funny reading that book when you're like, oh gosh, Jenny Fleming, she's so irresponsible, she's so awful. And then we see Mary's point of view, and it's like, that's just the coolest governess I ever had.
Well, how old was Mary? Like 4 or 5 at that time? Like 6?
Yeah, she was very little. Yeah.
So, like, yeah, of course she liked it. Like, that was super fun, but still very irresponsible. I still don't like Jenny Fleming.
And she was busy stripping the king, so.
That's right. Not only was she irresponsible with the kid, she was focused on her own, like, power and advancement at the expense of the kid, which, anyway, don't get me started. Okay, back to Mary, Queen of Scots.
There's an observation on 172 that I also really liked, which was she's thinking about her uncles and how she's learned to talk and confide with them. But although she was a queen and they were only princes of the blood, still they towered over her, golden, invincible, filling the room like an organ with the invisible roulades of power. And just this idea that there may be a hierarchy in terms of, like, well, she's a queen and they're just princes, but there's also a reality, which is who wields the power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then
and that Lymond is the same.
Lymond is the same, yeah. That her memories of him are, like, so different, and it's like, was he like that back then and she just didn't see it, or has he changed and she doesn't know for sure?
Right. And we do, I mean, if we think back to the early books and the way that he interacted with her, he was different with her. Like, he treated her like a kid, and he sort of knelt down to her level and told her stories. And so her memory of him is going to be almost like playmate, kind of, like someone who will play with me and tell me stories, as opposed to this man of power who's making decisions and all of that. Yeah.
And he has also legit changed. Like, I think obviously Tatty Boy was not known for his bearing of power. But even Vervassel, although he was more of a stronger kind of figure, was still relatively low ranking. He wasn't the same as Lymond now, as this really powerful, figure at the top of the political world. A herald to the Queen of Scotland is very different from this super general Order of St. Michael guy.
Well, she even knew him before that. they go all the way back to that field where he was sort of sitting in the flowers, and she like came over and started playing with him.
Yeah, when he was in disguise as a monk.
Mm.
Yeah.
And she recognized him the next time she saw him.
Yeah, and she, among everyone else, she's like the one person who knew Tatty Boy was Lymond the whole time and didn't even realize that he was in disguise and nobody else knew.
Right.
Because
kids are so insightful about stuff sometimes. But they don't have the preconceived notions about what people do. And
yeah, but it's really interesting to think back to how Lymond was like in Game of Kings, when he's an outlaw on the outskirts of society and everybody wants him dead, and then to be here where he's this super powerful figure in France with all these, you know, golden chains. He has changed so much, and like his position in the world has changed so much, and his like the archetype of what he is, he's not Robin Hood anymore, you know, has changed so much. So I always find it's really fun to go back to the beginning and be like, wow, it's so different. Like no one's bowing to him. They're all trying to kill him.
Well, that hasn't really changed. They're still all trying to kill him. Not all of them, but there's always someone.
Kill him or use him. Yeah. And then Mary so wants him to stay with Philippa, and he really doesn't want to. Yeah, I love the bit about where he's talking about her mother and Philippa, and he says, I'm an ardent admirer of both ladies, but I do not wish to be married to either of them.
And even there, he, because she gets a little offended by that. And so it's like he's talking to her like he used to. And then he's like, okay, now I'll put up a little more wall and be a little more proper with you because you're offended.
Yeah.
She's not a little kid anymore.
And also, I love this. His reason for that, like the reason for the way that he spoke to her is that he says he's sorry. And then I've been redirected so often against my own interests that I am a little wary, perhaps, when all my friends seem to approach me with wheel-lock arquebuses in their hands instead of handkerchiefs. So he's like, everyone's trying to manipulate me into doing the things I don't want to do.
Yeah. It's definitely an issue. She's just another one doing it.
Yeah.
All right. Should we move on to chapter 4, or do you guys have any other stuff for 3? Philippa comes back. Yay.
Yay, Philippa. So we sort of go back a little bit in the beginning and find out what Philippa has been doing before she's in this room. So she's still seeking the parentage of Lymond. And she realizes now that she is in love with him, which is great. She goes to Sevigny, Blois, and Notre Dame de la Guiche. I don't know how to pronounce that. And she's all searching for information. She does not find a door that this key fits into, but she does learn small tidbits in all 3 places, upon which she lets Lymond know later in the chapter. She is summoned back to Mary Queen of Scots, who is in Paris, and she gets there, and that's when we pick up from where we were at the end of the last chapter. Lymond and Philippa are sort of talking to Nostradamus, who, it's funny because he's another sort of prestidigitator, another future teller. He's the 3rd major one we've seen in these books now. And of course, he knows of the Dame de Dutance and mentions that she had a daughter named Beatrice, which is news. I don't think we had known that she had children before, a child out of wedlock. Did we know that?
We knew. Yeah, we knew that. It was brought up in Queen's Play that she had a daughter. Because I remember saying, oh, I wonder if her daughter, like I was curious about if she was related to the people that we were talking about. At some point, her daughter came up earlier.
So she was mentioned. I just don't remember that part. It's interesting that Mary Fleming on page 183 says, oh, they disliked each other between Lymond and Philippa. So they're clearly both trying to sort of put off this air of disinterest in the other, which is funny. Lymond and Philippa go into the next room and talk. And this is where we learn a lot of the information that Philippa has learned on her travels. So Beatrice the Dame de Dutance's daughter, is possibly Lymond's mother, and is definitely, according to her information, Marta's mother. And I think this is very interesting because all the way back in Queen's Play, I was like, what is the Dame Dutance like a secret grandmother or something? And I was like, oh shit, she really is, possibly.
That's why we thought that, I think, is because we both said that, it's like she's like the secret grandmother. And there had to have been mentioned Beatrice at least off to the side for us to say that, right?
Oh, true. Yeah. I forgot about that completely. The daughter part. So anyway, they go back and forth about the information that she found. There is a woman who was in the Notre Dame de la whatever it is with Sibylla, because Sibylla also was at this, what was it, a seminary?
Convent, something
like that. So there was another woman named Renée Jourda, who apparently was one of the three people to sign the contracts that Sibylla wrote out, saying that Lymond and Eloise are both her children. But this Renée Jourda person, who is possibly still alive, is living right in the middle of the war zone where Spain and France are fighting right now. So Lymond tries to extract a promise from Philippa saying that she will pursue it no further because it would be dangerous to her to go after her. Philippa's like, I will do no such thing. Like, no. So instead of worrying about that, Lymond promises to send for Renée Jourda and have her brought. And sort of at the end of the chapter,
and for me to go himself.
Yes, he's just gonna do it. And then at the end of the chapter, he sort of brings Archie with him to start this next task. He says he's not interested anymore in finding out the truth, but because Philippa would be put in danger because he knows that she won't stop, he's gonna take care of it himself.
He certainly has legit reason to know that Philippa, once she sets her mind on something, will not stop. So
absolutely.
She's exactly the kind of person that would be barreling off into a war zone to get information. So
absolutely,
do it himself.
I really loved how Dunnett, through Philippa's point of view on 177, Dunnett gives this like beautiful, perfect explanation of what it's like to have a crush as a kid, like as a young teenager. It's just, it was so perfect. It had been painful, but only a little. It was self-inflicted pain, teamed with excitement and pleasure, and an innocent awareness that one was touching the fringe of something real, which might lie around the next corner. When it came, one would know what to do with it. And meanwhile, one need suffer only as much as one wanted to. It was a game. And I'm like, oh, that's such a perfect description of like young teenage crush.
Yep, I remember it well. And also just the description of the sort of crushes she had and the ways that she'd like arranged to be in the garden when he happened to call, or in the marketplace on the day he might ride through. And I'm like, yep, I remember taking like a different route to get to my locker so I could walk
to my locker. So true. It's like, can I walk by his locker that, like, and I knew the schedule of the boy that I had a crush on, and like when he would probably go to his locker. And totally.
I'm just hoping.
I also love in this part how she sort of remembers her father and how he treated this. She remembered her father remarking on finding the salve that he didn't know she was bad with her fetlocks. Later, she recognized the anxiety and very likely the kindly hysteria with which her parents had watched all her antics. So like, she's not being coy about any of those things. Like, it's pretty obvious to those around her what's going on.
Yeah. But also I think it's really interesting, like, Dee, you could have pointed this out. I think you both pointed this out earlier, which was she thinks back on her whole relationship with Lymond, and realizes that she's had this growing crush on him the whole time that she hadn't been consciously aware of. And you guys kind of called that out when we were reading like Pawn, and it's like, why is she following this guy? Really, just for the baby? Like, there's something else going on there. And it's like, yep, there was something else going on there.
Yeah, this bit about right where it says it had been so different, her growing interest in Lymond, that she had never connected the one with the other. So she did have a crush on Lymond. It just didn't look like the crushes she had when she was, 10 and 11.
A clear and shadowless light revealing why, through all these years, the condition and well-being of one man should have so concerned her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the description of falling in love, which I also I think is so beautiful. For an hour, blended with all she could offer, something noble had been created which had nothing to do with the physical world. And from the turn of his throat, the warmth of his hair, the strong, slender sinews of his hands, something further which had. Though she combed the earth and searched through the smoke of the galaxies, there was no being she wanted but this, who was not and should not be for Philippa Somerville.
So good and sad. And I just feel like he is for you. He is for you.
Well, and yeah, and that's sort of like then the first paragraph kind of kicks it off with this, like, she has decided that, okay, this is not going to be possible. It's not going to happen. And so the observation that Mary Fleming has that they dislike each other is really the two of them both having concluded this is impossible and doing everything they can to keep their distance.
Right. And they're trying so hard to keep the other one from knowing that they're in love with it. Like, they're both trying so hard so that the other person doesn't figure out that they're in love, that they're acting like super cold and super like dismissive and all of this, but it's really just because they're in love with each other and they don't want the other person to know. You're just like, ah.
So she assumes that Lymond does know that she's got an infatuation with him now.
Right. She thinks he does.
That's not, is he aware? I don't think so.
I think he might think that she has a crush on him, that's sort of because he was so dashing in that rescue situation, like, oh, now she has a crush on me. But I don't think he trusts it as something real and that he can have, or that he thinks that she's got a crush on him, but it's better for her if she's not with him. So he should just push her away because it's better for her to not be with him.
Right? I think she legit thinks that he knows, or he thinks she has a crush because of that outburst she had where she was like, this is who you should be. I think she feels she's revealed herself, but she doesn't have any reason to think he would know that she's really like deeply head over heels, once in a lifetime, only in love with him, Right. I think she's thinks, well, all he knows is it's a crush in the vein of Robin Stewart and a million other people. And so she's trying to hide the depth of it.
Yeah. And I don't think he does know the depth of it. I think not at all. And he's just trying to do what he thinks is best for her, which, why does he get to decide?
But I think also, just kind of reading in the text, he knows something momentous happened that night because of that exchange with Jarrett, where he's like, yeah, nothing happened. He knows that like that chase had an impact on Philippa. And I think we can infer from that he knows that experience caused Philippa to develop a crush on him, and that he thinks that's a terrible, terrible thing that's dangerous for her, because of course everyone else who ever gets a crush on him, except Jarrett, dies horribly.
Yeah. And I it's so just the depth of this, where this is on 179, where she's talking about talking to Nicholas, and it says, in private he used Lymond's Christian name, and to avoid an implication which might wound, Philippa had to do so as well. It was a frightening pleasure, but one she could never again be made to indulge in. And it's just, then she says, the new flame was already stronger than she could well bear. It would be folly to feed it. And so even just using the name Francis, talking about him to a third party, is too hard for her. And it's just like, oh.
I get it. been there.
Mm.
And the way she's also thinking of like she's thinking of finding out his family background as a way of restoring his family to him, and she thinks of it as a monument to him. Like she can never have him, they can never be together. The most she can do is try to restore his family relationships as it's a monument. Like it's such a goodbye final thing.
It's like this gift she could give before she leaves his life forever, you know.
Okay, also I just have to say how embarrassed I am that I completely missed that when Lymond escaped in Queensplay and met the Dame de Dutance the first time, that was at her house in Blois. It is not the house in Lyon. So he hadn't explored the house in Lyon before. Maybe he'd been there for the fortune telling, but the whole first time they met thing was the Blois house, not the Lyon house.
Yeah.
Oh, but the fortune telling in Pawn, that was in the Lyon house, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because Guzelle was there and the dog. And
yeah, I think I missed that she had two houses too. I wasn't paying attention to the multiple houses.
But yes.
Yeah, but the place he recuperated after the stairway horse race thing.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and Philippe goes there, and the key doesn't open anything there, right?
Yeah.
And also the horoscopes are still missing, so they didn't find them.
Right. Yeah.
Because Nostradamus has them, apparently.
Yeah. And Philippa cries all night the night before she meets with Lymond.
Oh yeah, because she's trying to get away, and instead she's forced to stay.
She wept all night for the meeting which now must come, and which she had trusted never to be called upon to endure. So she was planning to never see him again in her life.
Now, I love Philippa. I love practical Philippa. And in fact, the next sentence is about how practical she is. But the weeping all night and never see again. Like, this is Philippa's melodrama coming out a little bit here.
Very melodramatic.
We also have this Mary Fleming noticing that Catherine de Albin's eyes follow Lymond. So if we didn't already realize that she'd fallen for him, we have another confirmation.
Yeah.
Two ladies here that are in love with Lymond, but only one that he's in love with back.
Yeah. Mary Fleming's pronouncement of like they disliked one another. It was painful to watch. Mary Fleming shifted uncomfortably. Those two would never remain man and wife. I beg to differ.
She uses irony like very yeah.
I love the foreshadowing that is, no, they will remain man and wife. Like, I love it when characters pronounce like this will never happen, or that will always happen, or that's for sure going to happen. And as the reader, you know, like, oh no, that's not going to happen.
And yeah, she thinks that Lymond is trying to keep his distance to avoid hurting her because he doesn't hurt the same way. And she throws up twice after their meeting, right? And before going to talk to him again. Like, this is hard.
Yeah.
And yeah, and this is where then we have the sequence about what she thinks is going on, which is that she hopes that he thinks of it as an infatuation. The burden of withdrawing from it would at least lie on him lightly, right? So she's hoping he just thinks it's a crush and doesn't realize it's like the love of her life.
She doesn't want him to be sad that he can't return her feelings. So she hopes he thinks it's just shallow, because otherwise he'll be sad that he can't stay with her. Like, oh, these two.
You said something like they just need to something.
They just need to kiss and be done with it and realize. I mean, it's coming at some point, I hope. But I'm sure there's going to be more of this type of thing because we can't just have it right away, you know.
Are they going to get like locked in a room with certain death the next day or something, and then they're going to confess all? That would be such a trope to happen. But
Oh boy, we already had There Was Only One Bed. Let's see.
I know, that's what I was thinking too. I was thinking like, oh, they need to have There Was Only One Bed. And I'm like, wait, they already did that one.
Enemies to lovers as well, at least in Philippa's view.
Yeah.
She always hated him when she was a child.
Yep. Okay, so then 185, there's a moment that always it just makes me take a breath, which is they're talking and there's an organ and she says, "Would you like to play? I'll pump the air for you." "No," said Lymond, and he turns and walks away because I think he's thinking of Una and the time they had that long talk while she was pumping the air for the organ that he was playing, which super hammers home why Lymond thinks he can't possibly be with Philippa because he believes he got Una killed and he's just trying so hard to not let Philippa get killed, which then also feeds into why he's like, I will go find this old lady because cannot possibly put Philippa in danger because he's so worried, like legitimately, that she's going to die because of him.
Right. Which she would definitely go herring off to get the old lady and die in the process, like for sure. So yeah.
I love that.
He's not wrong. Mm-hmm.
And you know, as like, I think it's also just a reminder, as annoying as they're being in the sense of like, you guys are in love, just be together. This experience he had with Una was so traumatic. I mean, it was traumatic for me reading it, so it was very traumatic for him experiencing it. So you can see why he's not being rational about, hey, we're both in love, why don't we give it a shot?
And I think Philippa is too. Like she sees herself as this, like, even with all of the sophistication that she has, I think she still sees herself as like this country girl from Flaws Valley, you know, and Lymond is this incredibly handsome, incredibly dynamic, now incredibly powerful man. And I think there's just this like, why would he fall in love with me? You know, and in that, just that disbelief that she is, and he's older, and you know, just all of that comes together with her thinking kind of reasonably so, you know, at least from her perspective, there's no way he's ever going to fall in love with me, so I need to protect my heart and not let him know.
Yeah, and she's comparing herself to Guzel, who's so worldly and experienced and stuff. She's not, I mean, she actually is pretty, has collected some pretty interesting experiences, but yeah, but you can definitely see from her point of view she's not realizing how amazing she is, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I express my disappointment that they were in a room with Nostradamus and he didn't give them another prophecy? I mean, maybe it'll still happen, but I was like, come on, prophecy time.
Yeah. True.
Well, we do have all the chapter headings as our prophecies.
True, if I could understand them.
I have not been paying attention to them, I confess.
The whole Nostradamus' prophecies, they're written so vaguely that they could mean anything.
Yeah.
So we do get this Lymond's sort of summary of his perception of all of this data. Like they've got all this information, and so then he puts it together in this story, which I think is very interesting and also very wrong. Is from that's 185 into 186, where he's like, okay, so then Marta and I are probably full brother and sister, because we know that Dame du Tance's daughter is Marta's mother, or at least probably. So Marta and I are probably full brother and sister, meaning Beatrice and Gavin's kids, is what he's thinking. Was the was the abbot, does Gavin, second Lord Crawford, proceed to sire brother Richard in his lawful connubial couch, and then move smartly off to Letcher in Sevigné with the Dame de Tance's daughter, while Sibylla, piqued, makes her own accommodation elsewhere. Marta is born, daughter of Gavin and Beatrice, and left to the poor Clares to bring up at La Guiche under the eye of the Dame de Tance, her grandmother. 2 years later, I am born of the same parents, just as Sibylla, by coincidence, has also produced a bastard son who unhappily dies. And he's getting that from that piece of paper, right? Where in his place, forced upon her by a vengeful husband, Gavin, I am substituted. 3 years later, in retaliation, Sibylla has Eloise, of whom Gavin is not the father, but blackmails her husband into receiving her as such. It fits. except for the fact that that piece of paper, those things about Sibylla swearing that Eloise and Lymond have the same father, the father's just blacked out.
And that they are her children.
But that could
Right,
have
and that they are
been the child who died, and he was swapped for that
child. Oh, right. So then she said, Philippa says, it fitted so neatly if you did not know all the people involved in it. She said, you assume it was Sibylla's love child who died, but what if Gavin's son was also named Francis Crawford?
If Beatrice is the Dame de Tance's daughter and the mother of Marta and maybe Lymond, who is Beatrice's father?
Beatrice's father or Marta's father?
Who did the Dame de Dutance hook up with?
I mean, she was one of the first people to mention to Lymond, oh, I knew your grandfather well.
No, I don't like that.
I don't like it either.
Well, and that would make it potentially incestuous because Gavin is that guy's son, so he'd be a half sibling of Beatrice.
This family tree is making.
Wait! My brain got twisted. Okay, so if the Dame de Dutance and Francis I had Beatrice,
yes,
and then you're saying that Gavin is the father of.
I'm saying Francis.
That would be
Gavin's father.
So that would be his half sister, and he had Marta and Lymond with his half sister.
Yeah, then they'd be children of incest. So I don't know if Lymond is thinking that at this point, but it's like maybe one of the things he's worried about.
Right, which we have had children of incest in this book. It is not out of the realm of possibility for the narrative to go there.
This is true.
I just can't get away from, okay, so there's a couple of things I think are interesting here. One, Sibylla is there as a young girl, like she's in this town, right? So for her to be the mother of Marta and Francis, no, that would be later after she married Gavin. What if Sibylla hooked up with someone when she was young in this town and then married Gavin for some reason and then went back to original guy? Right?
That could happen.
Which, okay, so no, it's still not working. So she falls in love with Mr. X, marries Gavin, has Richard. Mr. X shows up again, has Lymond and Eloise. Because I will not give up. I do not think that Lymond's mother is anyone other than Sibylla. Like, you're gonna have to, this book is gonna have to give me much better evidence of that than what we have seen right now.
Agreed.
So if we go with the assumption that Sibylla is the mother of Lymond and Eloise, and that they had the same father, Richard's father is Gavin. What if Sibylla married Gavin because Lymond's father something happened to him? So she marries Gavin because she has to for some reason. But then Lymond's father shows back up again, and that's who she's really in love with. And that's why she has kids out of wedlock.
Also because Gavin is just a shit.
Gavin's a horrible, horrible person. Yeah.
I'm also not completely sold that Marta is Beatrice's child, because I think Sibylla was around at the same time. Mm-hmm. in the same monastery. Not monastery.
Is Marta older than Richard?
No. Richard's 10 years older. Marta's only
Oh,
2.
right. Richard's 10 years older. Right. So Marta's not older than Richard.
Yeah. Why would Villa have gone back to a convent after being married to Gavin and having a child? That's interesting.
Right. Like, did she leave Richard in Scotland and like go back to France for several years? Why? Like, it has to have something to do with this guy, whoever he is.
Mr.
It
X.
has to. Mr. X. Like, she has to have come back to France for him. And I really think I think it would be so interesting if it's Lymond's grandfather. I mean, if it's Francis the First as Mr. X, I think is so interesting, but it doesn't make any sense. Like, first of all, why would she marry Gavin if she's in love with Francis the First? That doesn't make any sense. Like, you fall in love with someone and then you marry their son. Why? And then why wouldn't, if he's in love with her, like, why doesn't he just come get her at Mid-Coulter? Like, how come she has to come back to France? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
I don't think we know enough about Francis the First yet. Like, when did he die? We don't know that. Like, what kind of...
We know that. No, we do. We
Do
know
we?
that. I wrote it down. Yeah, I wrote it down I wrote down this whole timeline. It's in the other book. I wrote it we know when he died. I think. Hang on. I'm totally getting it. Because I wrote down this whole... We had this, sorry. Okay, we had this timeline of like when all the characters were, because we had that chapter where it talked about, oh darn, I didn't write it in the edge of the book. I wrote it on that chapter. Like when everyone was born and when everyone died.
It was towards the end. Yeah, it's towards the end of that book.
My marginalia is not as organized as it should be.
See, I remember when he died, but I don't know for sure that it's something we learned already. I think it is.
I think we know. You guys keep chatting about this chapter. I will try and find this.
What else is there to chat about, Laura?
I'm looking at what I highlighted. I did highlight Lymond saying something sounding amused, but he was not amused, or he would not have missed the incredible point in all Philippa had told him. Which is interesting because either he didn't miss it, he just didn't want to call attention to it, or because he really is just so discombobulated that he missed it. Okay, super interesting. He says, "You once held me for a term to a promise, and I honored it." Mm-hmm. This is when he then asks her for her promise. And I do also love how she gets very, if I make a promise, I keep it, when he suggests that she might not. But anyway, you once held me for a term to a promise, and I honored it. I remember the promise. I'm sure you guys do too, but I don't remember it having a term.
Yeah, I didn't think it had a term either. I thought it was like, please just don't do anything that puts yourself in danger, or don't take your own life. Like, there is no term on that. Like, the terms would be until you die of natural causes.
Yeah, so I'm like, is he remembering it wrong? Why doesn't she dispute it? Is this a retcon? Like, what's happening here with the term? Because if I was her, I'd go, there was no term on that promise. Don't kill yourself.
Right.
Yeah. Do we think he's still suicidal?
I can see him putting himself in dangerous way to help somebody else. I don't think he would, at this point, take his own life. I think he feels like he's too useful and he wants to do all of this good in Russia. So I think that's more important to him than taking his own life at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I can't find it.
Do you have?
All right, we'll find it and talk about it in the next one, I guess. Because maybe in the next couple chapters we'll learn more about whatever's happening.
but we know for sure when Gavin died because it was at the battle of whatever it was, and we know that date.
The Solway Moss.
Was it? Well, we know because it was after that, because Lymond went home after he'd been on the galleys and Gavin turned him out.
Oh, right.
And Gavin is dead at the beginning, so he must have died just a couple of years before that book.
Mm-hmm.
No great loss.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure we know that Francis I died when Lymond was a toddler.
Yeah, I thought so. I think we have that date somewhere.
I think.
Okay, well, we'll find it. But wait, toddler is a toddler like 2 years old?
Somewhere around there.
So he could, if he is Lymond's father, he could also be Eloise's father. Okay.
Yeah, I think Lymond's father and Eloise's father are the same person.
Right.
I do not think Sibylla is randomly sleeping with multiple people.
No, I don't think so either.
I think there is someone that she was in love with, and that person is Lymond and Eloise's father, and that person is not Gavin. Like, that she's in love with some man, not Gavin.
You think she was in love with this man before Gavin, and then something happened and she married Gavin, and then said man, Mr. X, comes back into her life for some reason.
And I think he was in France because she was at this convent when she was a teenager.
Mm.
And that's where she would have met him. And then for some reason she marries Gavin, even though he's terrible. And then Mr. X comes back later and he goes to France to be with him for some reason. And I think it would be interesting if it was Lymond's grandfather, who's actually his father. I think that would be interesting. But
so we know the truth.
I don't know. Yeah. And then it's like, that doesn't make any sense, because why would she marry Gavin?
It's got to be somewhere in here.
Yeah. Somewhere in these pages. Yeah.
So there's just a little bit at the end of this chapter as well that I wanted to talk about, but did you want to talk any more about the earlier stuff and the heritage and Philippa?
I do think he's distracted by this stuff. So there's this point at 187 where it says 10 minutes later, they're talking about Sibylla. 10 minutes later becomes the mother of her eldest child, Richard, the third Lord Cofford, and as it turns out, the only legitimate offspring. A poor record even for Scotland. Lymond said, his voice amused, but he was not amused. So his voice is amused, but he's not amused, or he would not have missed the vital, incredible point in all Philippa had told him. So I love that he's trying to come off. It's just another example of him, like his affect and his voice are saying one thing, but actually something else is going on, and he is distracted by all of this. So,
well, it is really, it's very telling that every time we're in his point of view, he's having these intense emotional reactions to things. And every time we're looking at him from outside, we're seeing this facade of not having these reactions. And it's just like, if you go back and reread the entire series, knowing that he's got all these intense reactions happening underneath, it's like every scene is completely different now. The whole thing is different. He's a different character even.
Yeah. I do think I wrote off to the side. So Lymond's like, do I want to know I'm Gavin's son? And Philippa says, I think you want to know. I don't think it matters to you what your parentage was, but I think you need to know the truth about Sibylla. And off to the side, I just wrote, ask her. Like, there's a really simple solution to all of this, which is go ask Sibylla. But apparently no one wants to do that.
It is pretty awkward. How do you ask that question?
Yeah, but is it as awkward as going into a war zone to get an old lady who may or may not be dead? Like, just go ask your mother.
Awkward. It's just less, mortal.
Yeah. True.
So in this final section, we have Lymond and Archie talking. Lymond is reclining with his feet up on the window seat. He says, it's a general blight of disorientation. I don't know the time either. he's telling us and Archie that he's having an episode right now. He can't see because he can't check the time, which is also obvious from the exchange. They have a moment after where he says he's going to send Cloud. Archie says, "And how do you propose to get there, sir?" And like, well, why would it be a problem for him to get there? And Lymond says, well, there's a wagon leaving. That's how I'm going to get there. So like, why would that be a problem that he would need to take a wagon? Well, because he's blind. He can't ride a horse.
As Lymond says, stop making matters worse.
Did you guys pick up on that though? Because like the first time I read it, I missed a lot of this stuff.
No, I got it, but only because you'd said earlier about the time thing. So you'd mentioned earlier about him checking the time and being able to see the time. So then when he said, I don't know the time either, I was like, oh, yeah. But I don't think I would have picked up on it if you hadn't said something before.
It's very subtle.
Yeah. I love that Lymond's going to be rude to Nostradamus. Archie's like, you haven't said a civil farewell. He's like, I'm not going to.
I don't want another damn prophecy. Even though even though I do.
Yeah. I'll come with you to St. Cloud and I'll cut your meat at Archie's like, I'll even feed you when you're blind, but there's a limit to what I'll do.
What inspires Archie telling him there's a limit to what I'll do for you?
I think Archie is not going to lead. Like, I think if Lymond is blind and dependent on Archie, Archie is not going to like lead him into certain death. You know, he's not going to let Lymond do that. And it's sort of like he'll help him so far, but no further. And yeah.
I agree with you. I think it's also interesting though, because we have Danny casting aspersions on Archie. And so now we're sort of being primed to read these interactions with Archie in two ways. One is like, has Archie turned? Is this actually like Archie's dark side? And of course not, but
no. That doesn't even cross my mind. Like when Danny was casting aspersions on Archie, my thought was like, oh, Danny, you're reading that completely wrong. So yeah, no.
So we've been left with this setup for Lymond to go into this war zone to find out the mystery of his heritage from this old woman. What do you guys hope and expect what is going to be happening next?
He's headed to the war zone, so I hope he doesn't get into trouble or captured or something. I don't know, but it's probably not going to turn out great. He may find the woman. I think she's probably still alive, and he may get like the next piece of information, but it's still not going to be the whole kit and caboodle yet. So
yeah,
there's too much.
Yeah. And there was something that I have a vague memory of reading, but I don't remember where it was, about the city that King Philip is in, Ham or something. And I forgot what it said about the city. So I'm wondering if whatever that was is going to come to play as well. I know that's super vague, but I just remember thinking, oh, that's interesting. And then, oh, the king's there. They can't go there. Well, now he's going there. So whatever it was. Yeah.
How about this Catherine and Philippa love triangle thing?
Oh, I want to quote Clue, the movie Clue, where it's like communism was just a red herring. You know, it's like she's just there to be an obstacle. It's not. Yeah.
Any final thoughts on these?
Find her own person eventually.
We're hopeful for the rest. Final thoughts, hopes.
I'm looking forward to finding out what the deal was with.
Let's get some answers.
Doran and Gavin and Mr. X and all the people.
Awesome.
Beatrice now apparently.
Beatrice. Love the name.
And Marta and Eloise.
Yeah.
All right, well.
So also there's that wrinkle. So if Beatrice if Marta is Beatrice's daughter with Mr. X, then had he given up on Sibylla because she married Gavin and then she comes back? Beatrice dies in childbirth with Marta, if she's Marta's mother.
No.
I gotta find that piece of paper. Maybe I wrote it on another piece of paper. I did a whole thing about when all the kids were born and like put it in years.
Yeah, I kind of remember you mentioned that. Yeah,
I do too. That was at the end of the last book, though, which feels like weeks ago.
Don't Google any of it though, because you'll get spoiled.
No. I want my own list. I made my own list from the information that was given us, I think, in Ring Castle. So I just need to find it. Before the next time, I'll find it.
All right, sounds good. Thank you everyone for watching and commenting. Bye-bye.
Bye.